Working in a liberal arts college is the opportunity for collaboration between departments. And I think that this exhibition and our series of programs really nicely highlights that. And I also have the pleasure to introduce a colleague from way across the other side of campus. Dr. Karin Warren, who's sitting in front of me. Dr. Karin Warren is professor and Herzog Family Chair of Environmental Studies and Science at Randolph College. She holds a BS in Meteorology from Cornell University and MS and PhD degrees in Energy and Resources from the University of California at Berkeley, where she held a Department of Energy Global Change Fellowship. Her areas of research include energy and sustainable development, climate and global change, and quantitative environmental methods. She has served on the Landscape Ordinance and the Stormwater Ordinance Revision Committee for the City of Lynchburg, the City of Lynchburg's National Resources Advisory Committee, and the Board of Religious Education Committee of Agadas Shalom Synagogue. She is co-chair of Randolph College's Sustainability Council, a faculty advisor for the Student Environmental Club, and the campus liaison for the President's Climate Commitments. She also oversees the Little Scientists event at the Central Virginia Science Festival at Randolph College. And I know from my students that she's also a student favorite in the department. So thank you, Dr. Warren, for being here, and she will be moderating our panel. Oh, sorry, I got it in my. We don't want any feedback happening. Yeah.
Okay, we're good. Laura, thank you for that kind introduction. I appreciate it. So, welcome, everyone. I'm delighted that we have such a good group today for this conversation. So, a few years ago, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere went above 400 parts per million for the first time in millennia. 2017, we now know from NASA, is one of the warmest years in the past 20 years, save one. Think of the forest fires that we had out west this year. Think of all the tropical cyclones that devastated not just the United States, but other parts of the country. And a few weeks ago, while we were freezing, highways were melting in Australia. So when we think about our future, we want to think about our present as well, and realize that we have to think about how to contend with the coming changes that climate poses. The climate is changing, of course, because of natural reasons, but increasingly because of human activities. And so a question that we're all going to be discussing today with all of you is how can our communities start to prepare for and be resilient and robust and thrive in the face of these coming changes? What actions are necessary? What policies are essential? And how can we move forward with an optimistic spirit? And so I'm delighted today to have 4 wonderful panelists to join me to participate in this conversation with all of us. I'm going to introduce them one by one. Some of these faces will be familiar already, in particular if you attended the artist talk earlier today, which I hope you did. I also encourage you, if you haven't been to the room next door to check out the installation, don't leave until you've seen it. It's extraordinary. And also make sure you read the information packet that's inside the doorway so that you can understand the backstory and motivation behind the works of art. So, sitting next to me is Rebecca Smith, our artist who's visiting this week. Rebecca Smith grew up in Washington, D.C., upstate New York. She has exhibited her work since 1977 in numerous national and international venues. Rebecca makes sculptures and drawings, including color tape installations, one of which is in the room next door. She lives and works in New York City and upstate New York, and has curated 2 group exhibitions of artists working within the theme of climate change, participating with artworks in both of them. One of them, Emissions, Images from the Mixing Layer in 2012, and Climate Contemporary in 2015. Becca's own artwork has taken on climate since 2005, and many works in the media of drawing, installation, and sculpture. Graphic tape images have employed tape diagrams and graphs to convey concepts of greenhouse gas effects on the atmosphere, including rates of atmospheric heating among various gases. Becca made a drawing of Earth's atmosphere with notes and illustration, and we're fortunate that that's one of the installations next door. I encourage you to take your time, look at it at a microscopic as well as a macro level. It's really a wonderful experience. She's now working on a project involving, wait, no, I skipped a sentence, I don't want to do that. Recent sculptures have played with scientific notation of molecular structure, visual conceptualizations of clouds, glaciers, and a pictogram form of Earth's habitat. She's presently working on a project involving adaptation to extreme habitats as exemplified by foraminifera living in extreme cold in Antarctica, and as a comparable situation to the human's adaptation in a future of extreme weather. So very relevant to our discussion today. Next in the lineup is Dr. Laura Henry Stone, who's a colleague from the other marvelous liberal arts college in town, Lynchburg College, where she's an assistant professor of environmental and sustainability studies. Since her days as a biology major at St. Mary's College of Maryland, Laura has aspired to teach other people about their relationship with the natural world and to promote more ecologically sustainable ways of life in our culture. As assistant professor of environmental studies, such work is exactly what she does. She prepared herself for this role by earning a master's, an MA in Earth Literacy from St. Mary of the Woods College, and an interdisciplinary PhD in sustainability education from the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. Before coming to Lynchburg College, she spent 2 years as a Mellon postdoctoral fellow of environmental studies and sustainability, followed by a year as a visiting assistant professor at Washington and Lee. Her scholarship and professional activities explore the best pedagogical practices for teaching about the human environment and sustainability. Her recreational activities dovetail with her academic interests, from through hiking the Appalachian Trail, to cross-country skiing in Alaska, to paddling rivers across the country, cycling on the Blue Ridge Parkway, pulling weeds in other people's gardens. She prefers to spend as much time as possible outdoors, immersing herself in diverse living systems, usually with her husband, and it's dogs plural, right? Okay, I updated that from your bio on no, there are 2 dogs now. Okay, as companions. Laura also received training to be a yoga teacher as a way to explore the connection between spirituality and ecology, as well as to stretch out those tired muscles from all of that outdoor activity. So, welcome, Laura. Sitting next to Laura is Randolph College's own Professor Rick Barnes, who is the Mary Sable Girard Chair of Psychology and Professor of Environmental Studies at Randolph, where he teaches courses in social psychology and environmental studies. He received his Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Vanderbilt University and a PhD in Social and Environmental Psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Rick is a member of the Environmental Design Research Association and the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. He was a member of the Citizens Steering Committee for the City of Lynchburg's 2002 Comprehensive Plan and served for 9 years on Lynchburg's Planning Commission from 2005 to 2013. He's taught courses in sustainable lifestyles and sustainable communities, including presently a class on sustainable cities. With the Institute for, has previously taught for the Institute for Shipboard Education Semester at Sea program. He is also the founder and longest standing member of Randolph College's Sustainability Council, which was founded as the Environmental Issues Council. Welcome, Rick. And our panelist at the end there is Kristie Smith. Now, forgive me while I switch over to phone so that I can read Kristie's bio here. We're delighted to have Kristie Smith here today. She is a Policy and Campaigns Manager with the Virginia Conservation Network, which is a coalition of more than 100 environmental organizations from around our Commonwealth. Prior to returning to her native Virginia, Kristie spent nearly a decade in Montana, building both a think tank and a progressive coalition of budget and tax advocates. Kristie now specializes in state and federal policies and regulations related to climate change. Currently, she spends her day at the General Assembly, advocating for renewable energy, failed utility rate structures, and environmental protections from frack gas pipelines. She's been very busy lately. Kristie has an undergraduate degree from Elizabethtown College and a master's in social policy from Columbia University. So please join me in welcoming all my fellow panelists, and after that I'll begin with some discussion questions, and I do encourage all of you to be a lively and participatory audience. This is meant to be a discussion among all of us, not just those of us up front. So welcome to my fellow panelists. Now, of all the many questions I would like to ask this diverse group of folks up front, one of the first ones I would like us to discuss and wrestle with from your different perspectives is, what would you say are the top priorities for communities today in order to build resilience in the face of climate change? What would you identify as the most important things that every community should be thinking about? And in terms of how we respond to questions, if you'd like to say something, just look eager or raise a hand, and we can go from there. And after this, I encourage you, ask questions. If you want to direct your question to a specific panelist, you're welcome to do so. If you want to direct it to me, and I'll pitch it out. So, oh my goodness, thank you, Rick. Forgive me. Before we get to our discussion question, which please hold that question in your mind, Rick gently reminded me that each of these panelists is supposed to be giving you a 5-minute introduction to their work. So, thank you for that. In terms of order, perhaps you should go in the same order I introduced you. So we'll start with Rebecca, and after that we'll go to discussion questions. So let me encourage you, while you hear what each of them discuss, think about what questions you'd like to ask, and think about that large question, what are our priorities for building resilience? Thank you for that. So the microphones are on, so probably you two can share one of those, and so forth.
Thank you, Karin. I just wanted to mention that in my position here as an artist, I see myself as both more of an amateur citizen in this kind of effort, but also a specialist in the art part of it. And I first came to this thinking about climate in 2005 when I was in Australia, and I was so aware of the holes in the ozone layer, and I just felt like something just happened to me, that this pressure of this question I was holding at arm's length, I just had to deal with in some way. So one of the ways that I started dealing with it was in my work, and as an abstract artist, how was I going to bring in content? So, and I'm going to show you with some images, because these people have so many amazing facts and experience that I'm going to try and, bring some pictures in to help me out. And this is noctilucent clouds, which are clouds that are high in the atmosphere that are actually a product of global warming, because they've only been seen in the past 150 years, and they have to do with increased methane in the atmosphere from different sources like agriculture, but also natural gas with all its methane leaks and pipelines. So as an artist, I thought I want to bring these kinds of clouds as a natural experience. It is related to a process that has only just started happening. And if anyone became interested in noctilucent clouds, they would start to explore it. So I wanted to show it and work with it. It also was a big challenge for me to make something amorphous and almost invisible into a physical sculpture. So I'm going to show how I did that process. That's the image. They glow at night. Here they are, same phenomenon outside of Edmonton, Canada. And this is when you start to break it down as a phenomenon, these noctilucent clouds have patterns and structures within them that you can see here, these whorls, the holes, these knots of clouds sort of bunching in here, and the sort of radiant bands. This is a drawing I made from that. This is another drawing that's in the exhibition, drawing for the sculpture itself. And here I am making the sculpture. Here they are installing it at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond. And here's a close-up. And this shows you the whole thing. One more image I wanted to show you, which was having to do with a science study that I participated in as a helper, which was measuring natural gas methane emissions coming from pipelines in Manhattan in 2012, 2013. And this, I think, we drove around in a car with a machine in the trunk with a thing hanging out to measure the methane, because natural gas is basically methane. So we drove along all these avenues and streets. I think it was about 60 miles total to collect data over several days. And you can see these spikes. This is a power station. We didn't know why there was a big spike here. This is 14 parts per million, and the baseline across the planet is 1.9 parts per million. So 14, affects not only people's health, asthma and things like that, but also climate change, because methane is 100 times more powerful than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. So, uptown, downtown, but this image is so striking, I think, and to me, the other artist who was involved, Ruth Hardinger, we just felt like this is an amazing image, and we built a whole show around it, and other ideas with several different artists who all use this actual study as inspiration for an exhibition and a panel discussion at the Cooper Union in New York City. So that's, I've tried to put this into my life, into my community, and I'm not seeking to, I don't have a big platform, but it is a platform, and that's how I feel that I'm doing something with the biggest, most urgent situation and problem that the whole human race faces and maybe has ever faced. So, thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, I'm Laura. I know lots of you in the audience, so it's great seeing so many friendly faces, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So as you heard Karin say, my PhD was an interdisciplinary PhD in sustainability education. But as I thought about what I wanted to focus on for my little piece of what I do in this realm for today's presentation, I decided I wanted to focus on sustainable food systems in particular, which relates pretty closely to what I did for my dissertation work, which was collaborate with an Alaska Native charter school in Fairbanks, Alaska, to design an ecologically and culturally appropriate gardening curriculum. Right, and so that's been a thread in my work ever since, over the 10 years since then. And so what I've been working on here in Lynchburg over the last year or two illustrates where I am with that work on really educating about food systems. So I want to talk about a couple of projects, but the theme I want to use to sort of integrate with our artist's talk and her show regarding atmosphere is really the role of soil and how passionate I am and how I've become about soil. Or dirt, what William Bryant Logan calls it, the ecstatic skin of the earth. If you haven't seen that book or seen the documentary based on that, I highly recommend it. One of the interviewees in the documentary is a woman, an Indian scholar named Vandana Shiva, who I just had the pleasure of meeting in person in my trip to India a few weeks ago. She has some things to say about the importance of soil as well. She's an advocate for sustainable agriculture in India. I'm going to introduce a more technical term than soil or dirt for you as well, which also provides a nice integration with our panel theme. I just learned this term shockingly recently, as in last fall, I believe was the first time I'd heard it, and it came up in a book entitled Art in the Anthropocene, which is available open access online. Has a bunch of really interesting work and commentary and analysis of artworks related to the Anthropocene. But a term that comes up, I believe, in the introduction of that book is pedosphere. Has anybody ever heard that term before? Pedosphere, P-E-D-O, sphere. Any guesses what it might mean? So ped is foot, right? So pedosphere is a good guess. It's some link to walking. And it's really the sphere in which we walk, which is the dirt, the soil, right? So the pedosphere is actually the sphere that I think often gets subsumed in the lithosphere when we talk about the different spheres of the sort of biogeochemical system that we're a part of. But the pedosphere is really that dirt layer, or the layer where soil processes or soil formation processes happen. So how does that relate to climate? Well, see, all these spheres are connected with the atmosphere, right? Especially our hydrosphere, our oceans and our water. I mean, it's such an interlinked system. And so the soil layer is really where a lot of human activity has the most impact in some ways, and in some ways what we're most dependent on when it comes to sustainable food sources, right? So I'm going to wrap up very quickly with 3 examples of some of the projects, well, 2 in particular. I mentioned Band Initiative already. But 2 of the projects here in Lynchburg. First of all, I've been involved with restarting a campus garden at Lynchburg College, and it's for me encapsulates what my interests in sustainability education and pedagogy with sustainable food systems, and how we need to, in my opinion, focus on food systems as a big priority in our community resilience work. But that garden is a way to engage students with the experience of learning about how we treat our soil and what we ask of it. But it's also an opportunity for me to engage in a long-term soil restoration project, right? So it's not just about growing food, it's about growing soil. And I'm really enjoying the process of literally starting with a sandy volleyball court and building soil on top of that, right? So, and then the other project I'll leave you with, and I also want to acknowledge that an important collaborator in the audience who actually is the project leader for this project that I'm going to discuss, which took place at Lynchburg Grows, a local nonprofit organization here in Lynchburg that has, most of you are probably familiar with it, has greenhouses. It grows, it's an urban agriculture program for, partly for employing people with disabilities, as well as for providing a sustainable food source. They have had a pretty large-scale composting program in the past, but we decided that they needed some help to re-stimulate their composting program. So with a grant from the U.S. State Department that Erica Mork, if you can raise your hand, Erica, please, got for us, and then led us through the implementation of, we had a program called Building Soil and Community, and I can tell you more about that and how that can be a model for the kind of resilience work and sort of community sustainability work that I hope we'll talk about some more. So,
what kind of community?
Community sustainability, is that what I said?
Last word that you said.
Community resilience work? I'm not sure what I said.
Building
soil and community. Building soil and community.
soil and
Soil.
I think it's working. Can everybody hear?
Yeah.
So we have atmosphere, we have soil, and we have psyche. Karin mentioned my area of interest and training is in psychology, but I've had an interest in placemaking and how people experience environments and how people shape environments for a very long time. I was reminded just a couple of weeks ago about how long I've been interested in this. I was doing some cleaning in my office, which I very seldom do. Never throw out anything. But I ran across a paper that I'd written in 1975, my first year of graduate school, and it was on integrating nature into the urban environment. So it completely forgotten that I'd written this. So I've had an interest over many years in environmental psychology and how people relate to their environments. Karin asked us to talk a little bit about what we're doing currently and how it relates to the topic today. There are just two things I want to mention. One is last summer I was asked by folks at the Northwest Earth Institute, which is in Portland, Oregon. Some of you may have heard of it. They do discussion books, short readings and leading discussions. And they had asked me to serve on a committee to update and edit a new edition of one of their discussion books. And the book was, Choices in Sustainable Living. So I worked with them last summer, and we edited the book, and it just came out last month. The other thing that I've been doing recently is, Karin mentioned that I taught on Semester at Sea, and one of the courses I taught on Semester at Sea was Sustainable Communities. And so this semester I've been able to bring parts of that course, adapt that course to teaching it on land. And we're teaching that here at Randolph College this semester. The course really centers on models of sustainable communities. And we look at things like how different communities use energy and water and land use, different ways of zoning and land use, and how that relates to sustainability. So I think that's all I want to say at this point. I'll pass it on. I'll cede the rest of my time to Kristie.
Well, thank you. Can y'all hear me? Great. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Fitting that I follow two educators. I fancy myself to be a bit of an educator, but instead of students, I spend my days talking to legislators, which, for as much as we grumble about kids these days, I can tell you legislators can sometimes be a little bit harder than students, I'm sure. So as Karin mentioned, I work in the realm of climate change, or policies that relate to climate change. But before I dive into what's going on, I'm big on audience participation, so I'm going to ask you one question, or actually two questions. How many of you know your local legislators by name? And just you know the name of your local legislator, show of hands. Great. How many of you have sat down to speak with your local legislators on any topic? Okay, so let's pursue that a little bit more. So right now we're in the middle of the General Assembly, right? And if we take a big step back, no matter where you fall in terms of political party lines, you know that in Washington, D.C., things are a little bit messy right now. But in Virginia, we are trying to find a way to move forward with policies that address climate change. So today I'll chat a little bit about what's happening right now and some important policies that are moving forward and ways that you can weigh in, not just this General Assembly session, but moving forward. So before this panel, 5 minutes before, my phone rang and it was a delegate from Roanoke. And his name is Sam Rasool. If you haven't had the opportunity to hear him speak or meet with him, I highly encourage you to do so. He is carrying two pieces of legislation on fracked gas pipelines that would protect our waterways and make sure that if these projects do move forward, your land and your water is protected. So the first thing I'll say to you is this. There are pieces of legislation moving forward on fracked gas pipelines right now, but we need to do a couple of things. When legislators like Delegate Sam Rasool stand up because they've heard your voices, we need to say thank you. We need to positively reinforce those leaders who are taking a chance in standing up for all of us and for environmental protections. The other piece is you have to call your legislators and ask them to move that forward, because they do mark that down before they go into committee. Their staff lets them know how many constituents called about a particular bill before they go and they vote on it. And it is our duty, if we care about climate change, to move that piece forward. So I'm happy to chat more about fracked gas pipelines, offline, again, a big passion of mine. But I want to spend the bulk of my time chatting about something that's been in the works for a while and how Virginia can really become a climate champion. So another question for you all, how many of you all remember the Clean Power Plan? Show of hands. Great. So that was President Obama's biggest piece of his climate legacy. And after that moved forward, the General Assembly held that up and they said, hey, Virginia cannot move forward on this. We're not going to be climate champions. Then Governor McAuliffe said, actually, we can be. And in May signed Executive Directive 11, which, amongst many things, poised Virginia to be on the path to reduce carbon pollution by 30% by 2030, which is a really big deal. If you all want to get involved in that, that is in the regulatory process, which is, it seems complex, but it's not. Right now, it's open for public comment, and you all need to comment. You need to say that Virginia needs to step up, and we need to take action. So after Governor McAuliffe left office, of course, we have now Governor Northam, and he said, not only do we want to perhaps address it through the regulatory process, we are going to go even further as a state, and we are going to do something that we have talked about for a long time, but we haven't gotten there yet, and that is join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So again, that's a little bit wonky, right? What does that mean? That means Virginia could reduce carbon pollution through cap and trade, and in the process of massively reducing carbon pollution, bring hundreds of millions of dollars into the state to mitigate the impacts of climate change. So a couple of pieces are moving right now, right? Hampton Roads is the second most at-risk community in the country in terms of effects of climate change. They're second only to New Orleans. Farms are struggling with droughts. Areas like Richmond, we struggle with clean air days. We are at a point where, as Delegate Sam Rasool would say, it is a reckoning. It is a crisis, and we have to do something. So the biggest thing I can say right now is there is a bill in the House of Delegates that would allow us to join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It would allow us to put hundreds of millions of dollars towards climate resiliency. And so today, if you haven't done so yet, we need you to email your local delegates and tell them to move this forward. Because if you haven't met with your delegate, if you haven't met with your state senator, please do so. They want to meet with you way more than they want to meet with lobbyists, I can assure you of that. And they do listen. So I would love to chat more about other policies that are moving forward or ways that we can engage, but I would say now is the time. People count on people like us being silent and remaining where we are. They want to maintain the status quo. I would urge us all to not do that, to stand up, to have conversations, and to speak your piece, because it is a reckoning. So I look forward to any questions that we might have, and I'll send it back over to Karin.
Okay. So I think now we have a pretty good idea of where folks are coming from and what kind of questions you might ask. One other thing to update you about in terms of efforts being made locally to build climate resilience is that Rick Barnes and I and Laura Henry Stone and also Sarah Woodward, I see sitting in the audience there, are all organizing a community resilience building forum in April that's bringing together stakeholders from across Lynchburg to talk about these very issues that we're wrestling with. How can we ensure that our communities are preparing for climate change? So, did everyone remember that question I asked? One I had forgotten we were all going to do an introduction, but now we have. So we can glean some of the priorities about what to do about climate resiliency from what you just heard. It seems very clear, I think, that Kristie would encourage us all to be very active with our representatives and make sure they understand our desire to move forward with policies. But I would like to hear some, if you had to pick top priorities right now for what our communities need to do to build resilience. And if you want, you can maybe explain what resilience means from your point of view. Does that mean, clearly food systems and healthy soil is part of resilience. Community awareness and activism is part of resilience. So if you could pick a top priority, and then we'll let questions flow from the audience at that point. Okay, so tell me your top priorities.
Well, in terms of what is resilience, we actually did a reading for my Sustainable Communities class recently on defining resilience. And the way the author talked about it was the ability of a community to bounce back from a disaster or bounce back from a threat, but also to bounce forward, as they put it in the reading, to plan for potential future threats. So I think in terms of priorities, it's communication and organization in the community, awareness of potential future threats, and the ability to organize to deal with
have communication, awareness. I love the idea of bouncing forward instead of bouncing back. I mean, backwards.
I confess that I am still actually struggling with the term resilience because my focus has been on sort of the sister concept of sustainability for a long time, and there is a difference between the two. In fact, I would call sustainability as the planning for, pushing forward, planning forward in some senses. But I'm a little, resilience just makes me, I'm still working on it. It makes me a tiny bit queasy because it sort of assumes disaster, right? So I think that it's probably a safe assumption for the most part. But that being said, I'm still learning how to use that language and how to adopt it into what my work is. But I would echo sort of a complement to the communication, which is education. You know, I focused again on soil and sustainable food systems, but I sort of take for granted that education of each other and of the younger generations and of our fellow citizens is absolutely crucial. And it's what I'm devoting my life to fundamentally, right? So whatever that looks like to you all, education, learning.
I as a layperson, as an artist, I feel like the thing I would suggest is imagination, because we all need imagination to get to a mental place where we can have an image of what's going on and what could happen and what may happen and what we're going to do about it. It's so easy to just not react and not think about these realities and push them away. And I don't mean to be grim about it at all. I think the part of, in fact, the climate movement has taken in art a lot, and music, and celebrating what we have, and finding and celebrating the community that's building around it.
And I will echo a piece on communication and conversation. So when I hear the word resilience, my mind immediately goes to physical resilience, right? Living shorelines, how do we keep shorelines from eroding? But the more time I spend in the climate movement, the more I really believe in emotional resilience. And I think we are part of a movement, and it is our duty to continue having conversations and to stay uplifted, because it's easy to get bogged down. There's a lot happening right now, but you can look at specific communities, even here in Virginia, where mayors and local leaders are pledging to take action on climate, and it's because people like you are speaking up. In Richmond, we're going to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels by 80%. Over the next 20 or 30 years, which is fabulous. In Hampton Roads, we have mayors who are pledging to switch to 100% renewable energy. And those things don't happen if people don't have conversations. So I would encourage emotional resilience as part of the climate movement.
Okay, so we heard communication, education, imagination, action, emotional resilience. You've all had time to contemplate the issue. What would you say some of the priorities should be for preparing our communities for climate change?
Well, I don't want to change the question, but I would like to just insert that what's important to me is what can I do and what can the community do to help prevent climate change, not how to survive it when it happens. It seems like...
So the mitigation question, what could... And partly any policy is going to have to do both, because climate change is already here and it's going to keep happening. So it's sort of a twofold strategy. How do we put effective mitigation, prevent the problem, future problem?
Right, that's
How do we
the
deal with it?
future question.
Okay. Well, they kind of go together. If we talk about how to build resilience, we'd like to, if we don't want a disaster, we can take action to reduce the probability of having one. Who would like to respond to that? What are some of the priorities for taking that? And Kristie, we know you can give us a lot of policy ideas, perhaps at the Virginia level. So, would you like to go first, perhaps?
Sure. And I think of this. I like to separate things out, right? And I put it into buckets, and I think about that in two distinct parts. One is, what can you do directly? So we talk a lot about the energy sector in terms of climate change, but actually the #1 source of greenhouse gas is the transportation sector. So if you want to talk about something you can do today, you can walk, you can carpool, you can ride a bike, and those things go a long way because we do have to get to that piece. Again, I know it feels overwhelming. What can you do? You can recycle, you can reduce your meat consumption. And all of those pieces are very immediate and they're very important. So don't lose hope. And I think from a policy perspective, call your legislators, call your mayors, ask them to reduce dependence on fossil fuels, ask them to move Virginia forward in terms of joining the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. There are small things you can do each and every day, and then again, sort of the calling and the policy piece is that indirect piece, and I would encourage you to engage in both.
Looks like you want to add something to that, Rick? I would like to hear your feedback in terms of, as someone who looks at behaviors and how to encourage sustainable behaviors. So.
Well, actually, I was going to approach it more from the city planning angle. In order to walk more and bike more and reduce your transportation footprint, we need to have cities that make it possible to do that. So as citizens, we can speak up for development proposals that are sustainably designed, and also speak up for speak against proposals that are not sustainably designed. Every time a new development comes up, a proposal for a new development comes up in the city, there are public hearings before the Planning Commission and City Council. Those are usually very lightly attended. People don't show up for those very much. So one concrete thing that you can do is be aware of what proposals there are for development in the city. Look at those from a sustainability and resilience angle and try to promote proposals that are more sustainable.
Can I give 2 answers?
Did anyone else want to respond to that question before we move on? Right.
I'd like to give 2 answers. I've been working on mitigation, but from the broader standpoint of trying to reduce carbon and working with Congress and trying to get what we call carbon fee and dividend, to put a price on carbon, rebate the revenues back to the households. That's one major activity I've been doing personally for the last 6 years. For your work at the state level, I've been working at the federal level. I'm a congressman that I know him personally. I'm on his Environmental Advisory Council. He pays no attention to us, but he meets with us. But we do have a conversation. And the other thing I've been working on is in the community area, in the area of developing the comprehensive plan. I was fortunate enough, I was asked by the county administrator of Randolph County to take the lead in developing the county comprehensive plan. And in the last pass of that, we did introduce a lot of the climate change items in it for a county that's 525 miles of waterfront. And so it's very important to us, and I've worked frequently with the people of Hampton Road on their activities. So there's a lot of things that we can do, both, as you say, at the local level. I've attended and I've led dozens of meetings at the community level, as well as working at the federal level. But it all takes time. And I'm pleased with what you all are doing. It's just great.
Well, I think it's very important to return to the question of the individual. And the individual can walk and bike and so on, and advocate for paths for walking and biking. But also it is important to advocate for re-establishing a very effective network of public transportation so that people wouldn't have to drive, even if they have to go far away and have a bike because of they're not able or it's too far. No, they could have, if we have a good local transportation system. In this case, bus system used to be what is it called? The trams, but they could be much more energy efficient altogether if you just think of Lynchburg, what Lynchburg could contribute in terms of reducing the fossil fuel use if we had a good, effective public transportation network. and then urge people to use them.
I know there are a lot of you in the audience who take personal actions to try and reduce your impact on climate change. Have you thought about how you might prepare yourself or your family to be resilient in the face of climate change? Or are there additional, it's kind of a two-sided coin. What action can you take to reduce your contribution to the problem? What actions can you take to be prepared for the changes that are coming? So,
one word I haven't heard mentioned here, and I wonder if it's fallen into disfavor, is resistance. 3 or 4 years ago, I think, or maybe less, when trying to fight natural gas pipelines, Bill McKibben, I think, was recommending resistance at every local place you could possibly do it, wherever, and he had a list of pipelines being buried here and there. And it was meant to be a kind of public resistance, just sort of getting in the way. But is that something that is just no longer viable or recommended or politic?
it's like Laura's eager to respond to that.
Well, I can tie this in, I think, a little bit with this concept of resilience and or mitigation and adaptation, and that tension between those different tactics and where to put our focus, right? I don't think resistance has fallen out of fashion, but it depends on the character of the community and or the city or the region or the state, and what strategies work best, right, for that particular kind of community. And so, for instance, to tie this in with the resilience question, there are a lot of folks working in the climate arena, working on climate action in one way or another, who have embraced the resilience framework because it's more politically palatable to focus on what can we do to protect our coastlines without actually having to talk about why they're eroding. So we could accept that, look, the coastlines are disappearing, we don't have to talk about why that might be happening if the priority is preparing for that, to protect the coastlines. Personally, I totally agree with you that that's part of the reason I'm a little bit queasy about replacing resilience in my language with a focus on sustainability, because for me, sustainability has that ethical component of what we need to be doing to regarding being just to each other and to future generations and to non-human populations. But I think a lot of this terminology and the tactics we use depend on the community, the nature of the community that we're working with. Right? So that's my my attempt to connect those ideas.
Kristie, would you like to comment on whether the resistance that we're speaking of has political efficacy? Does it make sense to devote one's efforts to this sort of thing? Can you give examples of when it's worked?
Absolutely. I am a big fan of the resistance. I think it does have political efficacy without a doubt. So anytime you're talking to a legislator and you're talking about, let's say, a specific bill, they'll say, who opposes this bill if I'm trying to get them to support this bill? And I think pipelines are a really good example of where resistance has worked. And more than that, taking a step back, how many of you are Dominion Power customers? Are you Appalachian Power here? Okay, so the utilities are one of the biggest power brokers, sort of pun intended. They keep their lights on, but they also wheel and deal a lot in the General Assembly. And both Dominion and APCO have been having a bad couple of years, not because I am in the halls of the General Assembly building talking to legislators about fair utility rate structures, but because people are demanding accountability. And I think one specific example is there's a group called the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, and they work on a lot of things related to climate change, but they work specifically around pipelines. They stage protests at the Department of Environmental Quality. They stage protests at the governor's mansion. And honestly, people listen. It may not be your style of tactic, but it does get attention and it elevates that issue into a broader narrative. So even if it's something that you're not comfortable with, I think strategically there is space for the resistance if that's what you're comfortable with.
Are there additional follow-up questions on that topic? Lots of hands. I want to give people who haven't had a chance to speak as well, so I think I saw a hand here from someone new and a hand here as well. So let's start here and then we're going to jump over here.
This isn't a question, but a bit of a response to the resistance question. And I guess this comes from my view as one of the younger environmentalists in the room, and I think that we need both resistance but also positivity, because we can't just say, no, I don't want this, no, I don't want coal. We have to say, yes, I do want, yes, I want solar. So I think we need both, and it's really important to resist something that we don't want, but we need to give an idea. We can't just say, I don't like what's going on. We need to say what we do want to have.
So we're back to the importance of imagination. I'm going to jump here and then back to this one.
What was the name of the Chesapeake group?
Chesapeake Climate Action Network. I believe they have internships as well.
They do.
So, students. Yeah.
Based a little bit on what you just said and what I was hearing earlier, something I'd like to hear more about, and has ideas I want to share around the difference between sustainability and more regenerative practices, or things that are hopeful or building that are actually maybe contributing to the other direction in terms of carbon sequestration or other efforts.
I think maybe some discussion about what we mean by different terms is useful at this point. I think some of what Laura said alludes to that. And sustainability is sort of an umbrella under which a lot of terms are popping up. Things like community resilience has been sort of a subset of that. So who would like to tackle that? How do we frame the question? So, am I expressing your question clearly? You all heard it as well. So.
When you talked about hope and what you want to ask for instead of what you're against, I think about the regenerative aspects of things that go beyond sustainability in terms of correcting the wrong direction.
Yeah, I think if I understand you correctly, sustainability is sometimes a really dry term, partly because we perceive it as just sort of sustaining ourselves or sustaining our natural resources without necessarily a regenerative vision that underpins that. So a lot of this conversation seems to be revolving around the strengths and weaknesses of the term sustainability, what something like resilience has to offer, or what something like regeneration or restoration has to offer. And I mentioned soil restoration as sort of one of my visions. And, I guess all I can say is that I agree with you that there's a lot we can do with the framework of restoration and regeneration that dovetails well with this imagination and vision of what kind of communities we want and what kind of society and civilization we want, and how do we work towards that vision rather than sustaining something vague or resisting or being resilient to potential disasters, right? So. And there's some literature and scholars who advocate for regeneration and restoration as visions for this kind of work also. Does that help? I'm just sort of confirming what you've said. Does anybody else have something they want to?
Okay. Let's see. Karin? And I do see hands over here. I'm going to try to give people a chance. Okay. So, Tony?
Thank you very much. I am getting a little bit disappointed because we as intellectuals start to get abstract thinking and conversation instead of talking about the real thing and the real lives. And the real lives have to concentrate on children. And children have parents, so this is the psychology that would have to be explored. Now, Laura, you happen to mention climate action. But there is an organization that's called Elders Climate Action, just created in 2014 by grandparents and great-grandparents who are concerned about their descendants, what would happen to them. And within that organization, just last year, a sub-project emerged called Dear Tomorrow. And Dear Tomorrow is a letter writing experiment whereby grandparents and great-grandparents, but now apparently even younger parents, would write letters to their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren about what their concerns are, about what their lives would be in 2050. A specific date when things would be quite different than they are now according to the current trajectory. And it's very ominous. and so they focus on their children and grandchildren writing letters. Originally, it was an idea to put it in a time capsule and open it in 2050, but now they are advocating. I just heard a conference on the TV 2 days ago when they discussed these issues, and what they are now advocating is to write letters to your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren as to what you expect might be happening in their lives in the next few decades, and publish it and share it among your family members and relatives right now, in addition to possibly putting in the time capsule. And the other aspect of this is to communicate, to talk about the issue, to societalize it. And there are teachers who are giving now apparently assignments to their students to write about what they expect things would be in 2050 or maybe 10 years from now, in their lives and in the life of the earth. And this is a very, very important aspect, I think, because I could talk more about the aspect of education, how important it is what the schools and colleges are doing, but I don't go into that because I would like to have this subject really be a major subject of study everywhere, because our lives and our generation, our descendants' lives.
I think that if we're talking about education, for one thing, I think all of us mentioned the importance of that. I think Kristie also pointed out that the more difficult task is educating some of our legislators about this. I know that I work with school children through the Central Virginia Science Festival. I think several of the rest of you encounter them as well, or we have children in the public school. In many cases, they're not the ones who need to be educated on climate change and climate science. They know what's coming. In many cases, it's older folks who are voting, who are making legislation. So I think when we talk about tangible actions, it's not so much parents writing time capsule letters to their children, but rather what's happening in the schools and what kind of curriculum is mandated at each state, and what the federal guidelines for education, not just K through 12, but what's supported in higher education, what kind of research is being supported, that gives tangible actions as well. But I'm guessing probably several of you would like to weigh in. And Carla, I haven't forgotten that I saw your hand up. So who would like to jump in on this importance, and maybe with some specific priorities for education or communication? Seems like that's sort of where the question was coming from.
So there's an indigenous concept that we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, but that we borrow it from our children. And I think we need to have a fundamental paradigm shift about how we think about this earth and our duty to it. And yes, some of this is abstract, and we do have a tendency to over-intellectualize, but we need to educate legislators, sure, but part of it, one of the easiest things we can do in addition to addressing curriculum is model good behavior for children and show them how to reduce energy consumption, encourage them to walk, encourage them to recycle. They learn a lot of things from us, and that is a very easy and very tangible thing that we can do and should do in addition to the more intellectual things.
Keep it short. Talked a lot.
Say what you want to say. We want to hear people.
To jump off of what Kristie said about paradigm shift, right? This, I think many of us would agree that that's really what we want to see happen is a paradigm shift about our relationship between humans and the environmental support systems we have. So this is part of why I'm so interested in pedagogy, which is really how we teach what we teach, right? Because education, I mentioned, like whatever that means to you, is a huge term that could mean somebody sitting here in front of you and telling you about new esoteric terms like pedosphere, or it can be about the experience of working together to create some kind of change, right? Like working with Lynchburg Grows with a whole host of different volunteers and students to work together on creating change, and that in itself is a form of education, and I think a much more effective form of education than even a formal curriculum that we see in schools. If we're talking about transformative learning, it has to be experiential. And so and the only way to have those experiences is to search them out, and if you're in a position to help facilitate them in whatever way. None of us is an expert independently about how to create this paradigm shift. It takes all of us, right? So we have to learn together about how to do that. And so experiential learning.
Modeling good behavior, experiential learning in all its forms. Carly, you were waiting patiently to make a contribution.
It's just really complement or I would hope supplement what has just been said. Paradigms of change the language. That's part of the challenge that we have. We keep speaking about progress, growth. Maybe we need to think differently about those terms. And, instead of using, and I imagine in the courses in sustainability, you do change your language.
We had a conversation about this just last week in class.
Change language with regard to a lot of things. We no longer speak of mailmen and firemen. Remember these changes? They're pretty significant.
So in terms of what measure of national well-being do we use? Can we move away from something like the GDP and look at something like well-being? Right. So that, I think we're seeing like economic thinking go in that direction, but there's a lot of resistance to overcome. Resistance not in a good sense, I guess, this way, but resistance to change in terms of, should we look at economic growth as the goal, or should we try to redefine it when we think about where our communities are going? So, who else would like to jump in on this while we're in this middle subject? Yes, in the back.
I'm just thinking that I wish that we were talking about the community as the world, because it is the world. And we, as one of the very richest countries, need to accept responsibility for our action and how it's impacting on people all over the world. And I think that's something that's not happening here.
I think this came up, one of you said something about having a moral approach, ethical approach. And one of the things when we think about communities and resilience is paying attention to those who are disadvantaged, who aren't in positions of power, whether it's not having wealth or being subject to some sort of discrimination or injustice. So I think that that's important. When we think about sustainability, we think about 3 spheres of sustainability. Most people just focus on the environmental, but looking at redefining the economic piece, and then that 3rd piece, the idea of social justice and taking a global scale look, I think, at least from my experience, that seems to be the most difficult part to move forward people's thinking. But would you all like to weigh in on that? Or does anyone like to add to that?
I'd be interested in other questions.
Oh, okay. Additional comments. Oh, over here, please.
I know you studied the psychology of sustainability. I think as another artist, I'm interested in cultural problems, specifically, how we talk about things, but also that there might be cultural threats to the environment. Not believing in science, or thinking that science perhaps is just another belief system. Ways in which we can disassociate ourselves or be desensitized to what's going on. And I wonder what you think, maybe psychologically or culturally, is like one of the biggest problems we have right now. What we, in terms of whether it's a community issue or individual behavior.
Before we respond to that, I just want to point out this is Chris Cohen, who's an artist. His work is displayed here as well, so those of you who don't know, I wanted you to be aware we have another artist whose work is on display who's here with us today. I think that was mostly directed at you, but everyone might want to weigh in on that, so let's start with Rick.
Just a quick reaction to that. Maybe you asked what are some of the most severe challenges, cultural challenges, attitude challenges. I think one of the hardest things to deal with is what's called confirmation bias. That in trying to change someone's attitude about something, you're really fighting uphill because people hold values and then they selectively seek out data that support their attitudes and ignore data that goes against their attitudes. So it's very difficult to change people's core attitudes and values. One of the things you can do is show how this particular threat, climate change, relates to their individual life currently. People are more motivated to change if they see the impact of the change on them personally, as opposed to seeing climate change as something that's in the distance or abstract or vague. You need to, whenever you communicate about climate change, you need to use specific examples about how it impacts that person's life. Just a few thoughts.
You know, I'll have something to say.
Absolutely.
There's a sort of a paradox in this focus on needing to address individuals and how they're going to be affected, right? Because I think one of our cultural challenges is the limitations that we have, and especially our culture, and focusing on the individual, right? And prioritizing individual well-being all over everything else, right? Because there are many cultures. Kristie mentioned the indigenous, metaphor of borrowing earth from future generations. Many cultures do not have such an individualistic approach to life. They have a much, a sense of collective community that's just part of their understanding of what well-being means. Right? So I think that's probably a key cultural characteristic to try to have this paradigm shift around to achieve sustainability. But on the other hand, I also recognize the pragmatism of focusing on how climate change is going to impact us individually, because Kristen mentioned, we need to take responsibility for our culture's impact on the rest of the world and all these underprivileged communities, but that message is just not carrying weight with a lot of Americans, right? It's just not. And so pragmatically speaking, how do we simultaneously acknowledge that this is our current worldview, this individualistic society we have, while also trying to help us broaden that worldview? It takes both, I think.
There's also, partly in that question, there was the idea of how do we deal with the sort of lack of understanding of science, or the idea that we can believe or not believe in science. And I think as a scientist, we always thought, well, we have facts on our side, and if we just explain our message clearly enough, people will understand the science and move forward. And I think the frustration that many of us have encountered is that that's not enough. So it brings back what Rick was saying about the importance of helping people feel a connection to how this would affect them personally. And what I found is that is more likely to put people in a mindset where they're willing to consider something that they've rejected before, where they're willing to reconsider what it means to think scientifically. And I think it's more challenging today than it was perhaps 20 years ago, because we're overwhelmed with information, and a lot of it's poor information. So when we talk about communicating, it's also partly how do we filter and digest information, how do we become critical consumers of what's being fed to us. And in a way, we have to recapture community in the sense of how do we interact with each other in a way where we have an area of common understanding before we start tackling difficult subjects. So I think this is where the social sciences are absolutely critical in trying to communicate message. And especially if we want to get to that idea of having a global perspective, it's hard to imagine how we can have that if we don't have a greater cultural awareness of how different communities envision this, and how you can promote your own well-being without exploiting the well-being of someone else. So, there are additional thoughts. Oh, I see lots of hands in the back. Let me pick on some people, not pick on, call on some people who haven't had a chance to weigh in yet, so I say your hand first.
So, kind of related to that, one of the things that I'm seeing a big movement in is teaching scientists how to communicate to regular people, right? Because I think I work with a lot of scientists, and, you know, they are really
Can you tell us what you do?
So I work for the Environmental Protection Agency, I'm attorney at the EPA, and, you know, so I work with scientists all day, and a lot of times they just feel like they have to just put it all out there, all their uncertainties, and you know, oh, well, we don't have this data. Well, then let's talk about what we do have, right? And a lot of times it's just, anyway, I don't know if you all are doing that at Randolph or Lynchburg College, you know, to really start educating scientists on how to educate us. But I think that's important.
Communication has become a bigger part of our curriculum, partly how to get into someone's mind, how to find common areas to discuss. Absolutely. You're Jennifer.
I'm Jennifer, yes, Jennifer Wilson.
You're coming to our senior seminar in a few months to talk
I
about
am,
seniors.
that's right.
That's your class. So Lindsay, I saw your hand up.
Going back to the kind of our pragmatic approach in the community, what we can do in the community, I think I heard you mention something early on, Dr. Lauren, about you're trying to put together a coalition in the community.
I was
Could
mentioning
you elaborate on that to see how?
Oh, okay. That's this is Sarah Woodward, who's our sustainability coordinator, sitting right there, and Laura Henry Stone and Rick Barks and I are organizing we're calling it a community resilience forum. So it's meant to be an opportunity to have a conversation among stakeholders. So we've invited specific key stakeholders throughout the city of Lynchburg, people who work in emergency management, people who work in facilities management at some of our key institutions, people for certain nonprofit organizations, to pull in a manageable size conversation about how do we identify some of our risks, our areas of vulnerability, and where we can start to build up capacity to be resilient in the face of changes that are coming. So that's in a couple of months, we're hosting that. I'm also, Laura mentioned earlier the importance of experiential learning, and students in all three of our classes are participating in the planning of the workshop, some of the background research, and some of the facilitation of it, well, not a workshop, forum. It's meant to be conversational, not us telling people what to do, but us providing an environment to have a good conversation and learn from one another. Hopefully identify priorities for moving our community forward in terms of planning and cooperation, ideally. So I saw a hand in the back. There we go. And then
I wanted to just comment about what's come up about scientists as communicators, because I think it's very, very important, and there's just an incredibly growing movement of artists and scientists working together, because we're both into observing, and artists are communicators, so it makes perfect sense. There's an organization in New York, the SCI Art Center, SCI Art Center, with lots of members that are both scientists and artists. I'm developing a project for elementary schools, students that is exploring science with art, specifically through animation. So there's a lot of interest in this, and I think that as much as it helps the artist to learn some of the science, it helps the scientist to learn exactly what you're saying. If you're a scientist and you have something I should know, I want you to be able to talk my language. So that's how we can help each other.
So I have some additional hands up of people who wanted to jump in on this. Also, I heard you mention animation, and I remember from the artist talk this morning, you were talking about wanting to do animation, and so you might want to talk. You have, okay. Wonderful. Okay, additional questions? Oh, okay, I'm getting the 5-minute signal here. So perhaps what we can do is try to summarize and distill some things from here. What messages do we want to take out? I think we've heard the importance of thinking about how to communicate effectively with one another. What about what sort of actions can we take, not just personally, but in terms of policy? So I wonder if folks would like to weigh in on what are some of your what top suggestions moving forward with the idea of positivity. I think that was brought up, and that's really important. The idea of having very tangible actions. Okay?
Can I ask
of course.
Kristie a question?
Yeah, you can ask whatever you want.
I wanted to ask you a follow-up about how you would recommend for those of us who are want to write our legislators, et cetera, how to stay on top of the legislation that we need to be focusing on right now. What resources can you point us to?
Shameless plug. Thank you for myself. So I work for the Virginia Conservation Network, and like Karin said, we are a coalition of over 100 environmental organizations from across the Commonwealth, and part of what we do is make sure that our partners and their members have access to good information. I'm in the Capitol all day, every day, and I can't keep my head wrapped around what's going on. So if you go to our website, which is vcnva.org, there are two things that are available. One, in the Learn category, there's a bill tracker. So anything that's related to the environment, we put in this tracker. It'll tell you the bill number, what it's about, who the patron is, and what the status is. Because one thing, if you're new to contacting your legislators, they want to know what's the bill number. You know, they want to know what your story is, but shorter is better. So if you can call them and say, hey, I oppose House Bill 1558 about rate design, great, that'll go into the folder. So I would say that's a really good piece to stay connected. And I have cards in my bag. I'm always happy to field calls or emails about what's happening and how it relates to the environment. The other piece that's available on our website is every year we put together a briefing book. So in addition to representing organizations, we bring together the best policy minds about environmental policy each year and have them write a series of white papers that we give to legislators about how do we address sea level rise, how do we get access to solar in the Commonwealth. And then that digital copy is available on our website as well, so if you want to be informed with facts, you can read up on that before you contact your legislator.
What was the website again?
VCN, like the Virginia Conservation Network, VA, like Virginia.org. And my contact information is available on there as well. But I would say, don't be overwhelmed. It's okay, legislators are overwhelmed. Pick one thing to follow, if it's only one bill, if it's only one topic, and follow that. And from there, it will just get easier.
I'm also going to tell you about an app I use that keeps me up to date called Countable. It's free, and you can click on it's mostly federal stuff. But you can click on which issues you want to be kept up to date with. So every time there's a new bill or something coming out, you can get updated on it, and it'll give you the talking points so you can call your senators or your congressional reps and be very specific. Another thing that I wanted to add to what Kristie suggested, you remember earlier she mentioned Executive Order 11, right? And that's a public comment period. So one thing I'd suggest if you do submit a public comment, just make sure you follow the guidelines so that they're able to take your comments into account. We had a speaker recently who talked about how if you don't follow certain guidelines, they can legitimately ignore your comment because you didn't follow the guidelines. So I think it's really good to know that that's an open comment period, and go and read about it. And thank you for offering to be a resource to everyone too. Any additional final thoughts? I think we're just about at wrap-up point. Yep. Okay.
If there's additional thoughts.
No ways to stay informed.
Stay tuned. I was going to offer you the opportunity of watching a little film about our Building Soil and Community project last year. We have a couple of preliminary versions, but we'll be circulating the final version when it's ready. That's fair to say, right? But if anybody wants to hang out, I guess, a little bit longer and watch our 4-minute version, we can potentially try to pull that up.
Yes, please.
Are you okay with that? How about if people need to go? I know we'll hold against you.
Before we go, I do want to remind you that you can continue the conversations with all of our panelists individually in the front galleries at our reception. Instead of rushing the stage and cornering all of them, they all like to get some nibbles. So if you could, after the film, then go over to the front galleries for reception.
In terms of doing things locally, joining local commissions, and
Follow Rick's example, for example, get on the point.
and natural resources, and so joining city and local commissions.
Right, what's the citizen, what did you do?
Citizen Academy.
Yes, Citizen Academy, and also to be, before you were on the planning commission, what were you on?
It's a steering committee for the comprehensive plan.
That's right.
And also the James River Association. I mean, our river runs right through our town, and that's where most of our drinking water comes from. And that pipelines are going right along it, right across the top of the watershed. So
lots of good local organizations to get involved with. James River Association, Citizens Clock Club, we have some people from there here. Lynchburg Neighborhood Development, Lynchburg Rose, it's been great to hear from people from those organizations. Otherwise, it's good to see your video, Laura.
Well, often they are code.
small cities across America, the city of Lynchburg, Virginia is a place where composting services are readily available. The community benefits from Lynchburg Grows, a small nonprofit organization that owns a 7-acre farm in the heart of the city. Thanks to an alumni ties small grant sponsored by the U.S. Department of State for Municipal Learning, we're holding workshops to teach people about composting. The project is also giving Lynchburg Grows members and members of the surrounding community the opportunity to bring their compost materials to on-site bins that were constructed by local volunteers. The finished compost will then be used after fall to help produce more food, thereby closing the loop in our food production system.
My name is and I am a former participant in a U.S. government-sponsored exchange program, in my case, the Fulbright program. And I was recently able to participate in the first ever U.S. Alumni Ties Seminar. And after participating in that seminar, I had the opportunity to apply for a grant. And in this case, we're looking at Lynchburg Grows being able to produce one of its own inputs and being able to, instead of purchasing a large quantity of compost every year, being able to produce it on-site and use it in its vegetable beds. As part of the grant, it was wonderful to be able to partner with another alumni of the U.S. government-sponsored exchange program.
I'm Maria Nathan. I'm a professor in the School of Business and Economics here at Lynchburg College. I got involved in this project because I'm a Fulbright alum, 2008 China, and a researcher in strategic sustainability and organizational sustainability. So students in the management consulting group, they worked on finding out how this composting project could be made sustainable over time for Lynchburg Grows. And they went and asked the community, how responsive would you be to finding a way to giving your food scraps for this composting project for Lynchburg Grows? And they had very positive response.
Hi, I'm Dr. Laura Stone in the Environmental Studies Department here at Lynchburg College. Some of my students also wrote curriculum units about how compost represents a piece of a much larger system that's connected with other aspects of our environment, including our climate. So compost helps reduce the greenhouse gases that are emitted into our atmosphere from decay of materials in landfills. It also is a great way to recycle food scraps to use in the garden, which is one of the big reasons I wanted to do it here.
I've been studying social entrepreneurship, social enterprise, innovative ways that nonprofits are beginning to develop sustainable business models. It's really important to understand the story of what's being done, what's being communicated, what's going to be the impact of this to the organization and to the individuals, and what are the ramifications of that long term. And so when we see how what we're doing really makes an impact, telling that story really makes a difference to the person who's engaging, and the people who are interacting.
Hi, I'm Shelley Blades. I am the director at Lynchburg Grows. We've had a really amazing response from our CSA members, and everyone's involved, and they bring their buckets back every week, and they dump it in, and they're excited about seeing how many pounds they have that week. But Cheesy Rider, they are a local food truck. They drop off their scraps every day, and also McDonald's, which is kind of bonkers and something that you just wouldn't think of, such a huge corporation like that being involved in composting. It's great that the climate is changing in Lynchburg as far as that goes, and I'm very excited to be a part of that.